multiplying, and dividing. Adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing is when you're putting things together. Factoring is when you take it apart. Factoring, now we're going to take them apart. Take the problem apart into what it was originally. So adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing is what we did previously. Factoring is when you break it apart. That's essentially what we're going to be doing. So factoring, again, should not be anything brand new. You've done it in algebra, did it in algebra 1, definitely did it in algebra 2. Maybe a little bit in geometry, but they don't really get into it all that much. So, first thing we start with is greatest common factor. So greatest common factor is what you use the most. So there are two ways to find the greatest common factor. Greatest common factor for numbers, greatest common factor for variables. So the greatest common factor for numbers is simply the biggest number that divides out of everything that you're given. Whatever the biggest number that will divide out of everything. So think of it as if you were reducing a fraction. If you were reducing a fraction, you're thinking to yourself, what is the biggest number I could divide out of everything? Whatever that number is, that's your greatest common factor. So some of you can do greatest common factor for numbers in your head. Just going through the numbers in your head. There are some of you that may need to write out the factors. You know yourself better than anyone else, but it does require you to know how to multiply. So if you don't know how to multiply, guess what? This is something that you might struggle with. There's no way around it. So in the case of 8 and 48, your greatest common factor is 8. Greatest common factor is 8. If you're thinking to yourself, it's not 8 because 8 was the first number. That's not true. It's 8 because 8 divides into both of them evenly. So all the ways you can multiply to 8, 1 times 8, 4 times 2. 48 is 1 times 48, 2 times 24, 3 times 16, 4 times 12, 6 times 8. Notice that 8 is the biggest number. Now, you do not have to list out the numbers. If you can figure out what the biggest number that divides out is, then by all means, don't list out the numbers the way I did. This is simply to visually show you how it works. Hopefully that makes sense. So, greatest common factor is 8. So for B, you have negative 15, 36, and 24. It doesn't matter if one of the numbers is negative. We're still looking for what divides out evenly. So, what could we use? All right, so Jordan says 3, so let's try 3. So in this case, 15 divided by 3 is 5. 36 divided by, so that would be 5, or negative 5. 36 divided by 3 would be 12. 24 divided by 3 would be 8. So 5, 12, and 8, there's nothing else that divides out. So that means that's your greatest common factor. Your greatest common factor is 3. So the main problem that some people run into is, did I take out enough? Did I take out the biggest number? So here's the easiest way that you can see, did you take out the biggest number? Divide it out. After you finish dividing, you look at what's left over, there shouldn't be anything else you can take out. If there is, then you didn't take out enough. So you have to keep going. Any questions, part B? All right, then part C. 48, 70, and 53. So is there a number that divides into all three of them evenly? So if you're thinking about it, you're probably thinking to yourself, well, no, there's nothing that works because of that 53. If you were just looking at 48 and 70, then you could take out something. But since you're looking at all three, there's nothing that comes out except for one number. There's one number that works with everything, and that's the number 1. So your greatest common factor is 1. So again, the easiest way to see this is visually. Again, you don't have to write this part down. 48, 1 times 48, 2 times 24, 3 times 12, 4 times 12, 6 times 8. 70 is 1 times 70, 2 times 35, 5 times 14, and 7 times 10. 53 is just 1 times 53. There's only one number that they share, and that's 1. So if all else fails, you can always use the number 1. Number 1's your default. So, any questions as it relates to a number? Number's pretty simple. It should be pretty simple, considering you've been dividing, reducing fractions all your life. Okay, any questions from anyone at home? Yes, Steve, go ahead. Steve? What? Oh, okay. Wait just a second. So, numbers is looking for the biggest number that works. Variables means they all have to have the same letter. So let's look at variables. So, Steve, I'll get to your question as soon as it pops up in the chat. So to find GCF, you can multiply or divide. You're looking for the biggest number that divides out of all your terms. So all the numbers you have, you're looking for the biggest number that divides out. So it is a division problem. So if you're taking the greatest common factor of variables, so first thing, they have to have the same variable. That's important. Everything's going to have the same letter. So in the case of A, you have 20x squared and 5x. The numbers we've already dealt with, so we can deal with the numbers. What divides out of 20 and 5? 5. So the biggest number you can take out is 5. So the biggest number you can take out is 5. Now you look at the variables. Do they have the same variable? Does each term have the same letter? So, answer that is yes. They both have x's in them. So, if they have the same letter, then you take out the letter and the smallest exponent. So you take out the letter, and you take out the smallest exponent. So you have an exponent of 2, and you have an exponent of 1. So that's x to the first power. So your greatest common factor would be 5x. Your greatest common factor would be 5x. So not only do you have to worry about the number, you have to worry about the variable too. You take out the biggest number, and if they have the same variable, you take out the variable as well. Any questions with part A? You okay over there, David? Yeah. Okay. Then part B. You have 24, and you have negative 30. So same thing applies. Biggest number we could take out would be what? 6. 24 divided by 6 is 4. 30 divided by 6 is 5. Does everything have the same variable? Yes, it does. So if it has the same variable, take out the variable and take out the smallest exponent. So the smallest exponent, you have a 2 and you have a 5. So the smaller number is 2. And your greatest common factor is 6x squared. Any questions for B? All right, so let's look at part C. You have 6, you have 17. 6 and 17. So, biggest number I can take out is 1. So 6 and 17, the only thing you can divide out is 1. One thing that you can divide out that's the same is 1. Do they have the same variable? So do both of them have a z? They both have a z. They don't have to have the same exponent. You're not trying to add them. You're not trying to subtract them. So as long as they have the same variable, you can pull one out. Z to the third, z to the first. The smallest exponent is 1. So you can take out z to the first. So your greatest common factor is 1z, or you can just write it as z. Any questions, A, B, or C? Okay, so you sound like you were mumbling towards the end, so now I don't understand your question, so now you have to repeat your question. So it's the variable if they share it. If they have the same variable, you take the variable out, and then you take the smallest exponent out. So in part A, the smallest exponent was the number 1. In part B, the smallest exponent was the number 2. In part C, the smallest exponent was the number 1. So if they have the same variable, now that's important. They all have to have the same variable. So if one thing doesn't have it, then you can't take out the variable. But if it does have the same variable, you take it out, and you take out the smallest exponent. Any other questions before we actually start factoring? Because you got to know how to do GCF in order to be able to factor it out. You can't take out a GCF if you don't know how to find one. All right, so let's start finding. Let's actually start factoring. So, the steps along the side is the step-by-step approach of how to factor. So steps 1, 2, and 3, we've already been doing. So for example 1, you have 8p plus 40. Find the biggest number that divides out all of the terms evenly. So you have an 8, you have a 40. What divides out of 8 and 40? 8. So, biggest number is 8. Do they have the same variable? No. Eight has the letter P in it, but the 40 doesn't. So unless they both have it, you can't take it out. So your greatest common factor is 8. Now we actually do something with it. We're going to take the 8 and divide out every part of the problem. We'll take every part of the problem and divide it by 8. So 8 divided by 8 is 1, so you're left with P. 40 divided by 8 is 5, you're left with 5. So to write your answer, you take the greatest common factor and write it, and you take whatever you get after you divide it, goes in parentheses. So those two parts end up going into your final answer. The GCF and whatever you got after you divide it. Here, when it says biggest number. Biggest number means what is the biggest number that divides out of everything in that problem. That's what biggest number means. Sometimes that biggest number will be 1. Sometimes that biggest number will be something other than 1. So, any questions before we move to example 2? And let's keep going. So example 2, we got 5v to the third plus 25v squared minus 30v. Same rules apply. You have a 5, a 25, and a 30. So what can I divide out? Take out a 5. Do they all have the same variable? Yes. So you take out the variable. What's the smallest exponent? 1. So 5v to the first. So your greatest common factor is 5b. So this is the shorter way of writing the greatest common factor. Instead of writing biggest number, same variable, GCF, you can always just write it like that, and then just tell me what you took out. So it's a shorter way to write it if you want to do it that way. And doing it this way takes you directly to step 4. So now we're going to divide everything up. So the numbers, so 5 divided by 5 is still 1. For the variables, so remember, when you're dividing variables, you subtract the exponent. So you subtract the exponents. So you have 5 divided by 5 is 1. B 3 minus 1 is 2. Plus 25 divided by 5 is 5. 2 minus 1 is 1. So 5b. Minus 30 divided by 5 is 6. 1 minus 1 is 0. So since the variable has an exponent of 0, it drops out. So there is no b attached to the 6.
Can you explain that again? Why there's no b attached to the 6?
Because the exponent became 0. 1 minus 1 is 0. That means you don't have any. So there's your greatest common factor. There's what you got after you divide it. So your answer is 5b, parentheses, b squared plus 5b minus 6. So if you ever question whether or not you did it correctly, you should be able to take your answer, multiply it, and end up back where you started. You should be able to take your answer, multiply it, and end up back where you started. So if you don't end up back where you started, you did something wrong. If you don't end up where you started, you did something wrong. Any questions either here or at home before we look at examples 3 and 4? Yeah, not hard problems, but they will push whether or not you know how to divide it. And multiply for that one.
Also, you might want to let them know there's a senior exit information thing that's marked urgent unless it's based on.
All right, just a side note, I guess there's an exit survey that you need to take from, wait, Dr. Olson?
Yeah, there's several steps you need to do.
Okay. So make sure you check your email. It was sent yesterday from Dr. Olson regarding senior exit information. So if it's not from Dr. Olson, it might be from your actual counselor. But make sure you don't just gloss over it, do it. Again, you're at a stage where you don't want anything holding up graduation, you getting your diploma, you getting your final transcripts, so on and so forth. Remember, there's one of you, there's 700 plus seniors. So they're going to worry about the ones that get their stuff in, and they'll worry about the stragglers, at the end of it. Yep, it says, yeah, it says senior exit information. I think one of those things is some kind of interview, survey, whatever the case may be. It was sent, it should have been sent yesterday. If it was sent by either Dr. Olson or it might have came from your counselor.
It has several forms relating to what you're doing after high school.
It's going to ask you about your plans after high school. It's going to ask you, it's a survey from the superintendent's office. It's going to ask you if you want to have a Google meeting with your school counselor. It's going to ask you about the FAFSA, if you haven't filled it out. Now, the FAFSA is a state of Illinois graduation requirement. So, say that again? Yes. That's exactly what it is. So again, you all going to get a lot of emails, but guess what? If you're going to college, you're going to be getting a lot of emails anyway. Your life will become an email address. So make sure you sync your email to your phone and do not just put it on. Especially that senior exit thing. Like I said, there's 700 seniors. If you don't do what you're supposed to do, they'll just push you to the end and they'll worry about you later.
As well as the HS Google backup. So you need to back up your Gmail as well.
So take care of all that. Don't worry, don't start with this too much. Every other senior has done it. You'll live. Anyway, example 3. 24x to the 5th minus 40x to the 3rd. You have 24, you have 40. What can you take out? What number can you take out? Four. I heard 4. We can do better than that. We can take out 8. So you take out 4. 24 divided by 4 is 6. 40 divided by 4 is 10. So then you'll still have to take something out of that. And both of those you can still divide by 2. So we can take out an 8. Do they have the same variable? Take out the same variable. And the smallest exponent is a 3. So our greatest common factor is 8x to the 3rd. So we divide out 8x to the 3rd. So 24 divided by 8 is 3. Keep the x. 5 minus 3 is 2. 3x squared. Minus 4 divided by 8, 5. 3 minus 3 is 0. So there's no x attached to the 5. Take those two parts, and that becomes your final answer. All right, so let's do one more, and then we'll deal with how do we handle negatives. 3m squared plus 5m to the 3rd. So notice that it's out of order. So when they give it to you out of order, you're not required to change it. At least if you're just taking out a greatest common factor. If it will make you feel better to put it in order, then by all means, put it in order. I would just get in the habit of if the problem's not in order, put it in order. But 5 and 3, what can you divide out? 1. Do they have the same variable? Yes. So take out the variable, smallest exponent is 2. So our greatest common factor is m squared. So if you divide out, 5 divided by 1 is 5. 3 minus 2 is 1. So 5 round. 3 divided by 1 is 3. 2 minus 2 is 0. So the m's cancel out. So there's the 2 parts that make up your final answer. That's that. Problem's over. Any questions before we deal with negatives after we finish example 5? Take it. Okay. Yes, go ahead. So whatever the greatest common factor is, that goes in front. Whatever you get after you finish dividing, that goes in the parentheses. It goes in that order. So if you were just dividing it, then you could leave it as 5m plus 3, or 3x squared minus 5. So reading directions is going to be very, very important. So if directions say factor it, and you don't factor it, then, oops, it's wrong. All right, example 5. So 5 and 6 are, what do you do if there's a negative? If it starts with a negative. If the coefficient of the first term is negative. So for examples 5 and for 6, the first term is negative. First term is negative. So if the first term is negative, then you're going to divide by a negative. So you're going to divide everything by a negative. But then you solve it the same way you've been solving. What divides out of 4 and 20? Oh, we can do better than that. Take out 4. So we can take out a 4. Can we take out the m? Can we take out the variable? No, 20 doesn't have it. So your greatest common factor is negative 4. So that's what will go in front. Now we're looking for what's going in parentheses. Negative 4 divided by negative 4 is 1. Bring down the n. 20 divided by negative 4 is negative 5. And there's your factor answer.
Not necessarily, I guess easier in the addition.
Say that again?
Are these the negative ones? Are they addition, like, can you give an example for it? You see, like, we went through this kind of quick.
The only step we didn't do is we didn't take out a variable because they didn't have it. That's the only thing you didn't do. Now, in example 6, we're going to end up taking out a negative, a number, and a variable because it started with a negative. So the first term starts with a negative. That means you're going to have to take out a negative. Looks like we can take out 3. If you were thinking 6, 6 works for 18, but it doesn't work for 27. So if you were thinking 6, 6 doesn't work. Do they all have the same variable? Do they all have the same letter?
Yeah, the same here, yeah.
Common factor is negative 3m. So you're going to have negative 3m, parentheses, something. I can hear everything in the background. But, so let's take out what we can take out. Well, let's divide out what we can divide out. All right, so first term. Negative 6 divided by negative 3 is 2. What's the exponent? 2m to what power? 2m to the second. Then we've got negative 18 divided by negative 3, which will give us negative 6. Positive 6. Positive 6. M to the first power. And then what's the last piece?
8.
Negative 9. And then 1 minus 1 is 0. So the 9 doesn't get a variable. So 2m squared. Brooke, I think you're off of mute, so I can hear everything in your background. Negative 3m, parentheses, 2m squared plus 6m minus 9. Now, for right now, this is as far as we'll go. On Friday, when we do MAF, this part in parentheses can be taken down. Can be taken down some more. So in Algebra 1, you learn how to work with two numbers that multiply to this and add to this. That's called MAF. So that's what we'll be looking at on Friday. Just a word of caution as we get ready to finish up brainstorming factor. When you factor something, factoring is putting it back as multiplication. Putting it back as multiplication. So if you are factoring 3m plus 12, 3 times m plus 3 times 4, that's not factored. That's not in factored form. Factoring something means writing it as a multiplication problem. So 3 times m plus 4, that's in factored form. Factored form means it's written like a multiplication problem. If you wrote it like an addition problem, that's not factored form. So it's always checking for yourself, is it solved, is it finished, whatever the case may be. Any questions before we finish up for this Wednesday? After today, you have 2 more Wednesdays left in your high school career.